Mary of Nazareth enters history quietly, without proclamations or titles, yet her presence stands at the center of one of the most influential narratives ever preserved. The earliest Christian sources mention her sparingly, almost cautiously, as if aware that every word carried weight. In a tradition that would later produce volumes of theological reflection, her voice is strikingly restrained, her words few, her interior life mostly implied rather than recorded. This restraint has often been interpreted as humility imposed by faith, but history offers another possibility. The world into which Mary was born did not easily preserve the voices of women, especially women from provincial villages in Roman-controlled Galilee. Nazareth was not a center of learning or power. It was a small settlement shaped by agricultural rhythms, ritual observance, and the constant presence of imperial authority pressing in from afar. Memory in such places survived orally, passed through households rather than institutions. Within Jewish culture of the period, women were not invisible, but their authority was largely domestic and relational. They taught prayers to children, preserved family traditions, and transmitted faith through daily practice. Rabbinic literature from later centuries reflects debates over women's speech and instruction, suggesting that such participation existed even when contested. Mary belongs to this lived religious world, where faith was embodied before it was systematized. The canonical Gospels preserve a handful of her words, but those words are carefully framed. They appear in moments of divine encounter, obedience, and praise. They are never argumentative, never corrective, never interpretive in a public sense. Yet, even within this narrow frame, her speech reveals theological depth rooted in Israel's scriptures. Her praise draws on the language of the Psalms and the prophets, echoing themes of reversal, justice, and divine fidelity long present in Jewish prayer. Early Christian communities did not experience these texts as isolated biographies. They were part of a broader oral environment where stories circulated, were retold, and adapted for teaching. In such settings, silence in written sources does not necessarily indicate absence of memory. It often signals selectivity. What was written reflected what communities deemed appropriate for public reading and doctrinal stability. Beyond the boundaries of the canon, other early Christian writings preserved alternative emphases. These texts do not invent new characters, but revisit familiar figures through different lenses. Mary appears in some of these traditions not as a passive figure, but as a bearer of understanding shaped by proximity to Jesus' life and teaching. Her authority in these accounts does not come from office or rank, but from insight and remembrance. One such tradition survives in fragmented form, written centuries ago and rediscovered only in modern times. It presents Mary as a speaker, recounting teachings received in the aftermath of loss and uncertainty. The setting is not triumphant, but fragile, marked by fear and confusion among followers struggling to understand what had occurred. In this context, Mary speaks not to command, but to steady, to interpret meaning when certainty had collapsed. These portrayals did not emerge in a vacuum. Early Christianity was not a single, unified movement, but a constellation of communities spread across regions and languages. Differences in theology, leadership, and practice were negotiated through texts, letters, and remembered teachings. Authority was fluid, often contested, and deeply tied to claims of revelation and proximity to foundational events. Mary's proximity was unquestioned. What remained contested was how that proximity should be understood. Was it biological, symbolic, spiritual, or instructional? As theological boundaries hardened, certain interpretations became central, while others were sidelined. The preservation of Mary as a symbol of obedience and purity aligned comfortably with emerging structures. The preservation of Mary as a teacher raised more difficult questions. Manuscript evidence shows that texts associated with Mary circulated, were copied, and were read seriously in some communities. The very survival of these fragments indicates that her remembered words resonated strongly enough to be preserved despite opposition or neglect. Their incomplete state today reflects the fragility of transmission rather than the insignificance of their content. What remains is not a complete gospel, but traces. Gaps in the text interrupt narratives at critical moments, leaving scholars to reconstruct context from parallels and linguistic clues. These absences have fueled debate for generations. Some argue they are the result of simple material loss. Others point to patterns of omission consistent with theological discomfort. What is clear is that Mary of Nazareth was never merely a background figure to those who first followed Jesus. She was present at the beginning, remembered in moments of crisis, and invoked in discussions of understanding and faith. The silence surrounding her words in later tradition does not erase their earlier presence. It instead invites a closer examination of how memory is shaped, constrained, and curated. To approach Mary historically is not to diminish her significance, but to restore it to a human scale, grounded in real communities, real tensions, and real choices. Her story does not begin with erasure. It begins with remembrance, selective, contested, and deeply revealing of the world that preserved it. To understand why Mary's remembered words could later be diminished or excluded, it is necessary to return to the social and religious landscape of first-century Judea and Galilee. Jewish life at the time was ordered by covenant, law, and ritual practice, yet it was far from monolithic. Competing interpretations of Scripture existed side by side, shaped by sectarian communities, temple authorities, village teachers, and family traditions. Authority flowed not only from institutions but from mastery of memory and interpretation. Women occupied a complex position within this world. They were bound by religious obligations, participated in festivals, and shaped the spiritual formation of households. Ancient Jewish sources attest that women memorized prayers, recited blessings, and instructed children in foundational narratives of Israel. While formal public teaching roles were limited, wisdom was not confined to formal settings. Knowledge moved through kitchens, courtyards, and pilgrim roads, carried in speech rather than scrolls. Mary's upbringing would have been saturated with Scripture heard aloud rather than read privately. Psalms, prophetic oracles, and ancestral stories formed a shared vocabulary of hope and expectation. Her later words, as preserved in the canonical tradition, reflect this immersion. They do not quote Scripture mechanically. They breathe it. This suggests not passive reception, but active internalization shaped by lived devotion. Early Christianity inherited this oral culture. Jesus himself taught through speech, parable, and memory rather than written treatise. His followers preserved his words in similar ways, repeating them in gatherings and embedding them within narrative frameworks. In such a setting, those closest to events played a decisive role in shaping how memory survived. Authority often followed proximity, not hierarchy. Mary's proximity was singular. She was not simply present at key moments. She embodied continuity between Jewish expectation and emerging Christian belief. For early followers struggling to interpret loss, suffering, and delayed fulfillment, figures who could speak across that divide held particular weight. This helps explain why some traditions remembered her as a source of insight rather than silence. Texts associated with early Christian diversity reflect these tensions. Some writings emphasize apostolic authority tied to mission and public proclamation. Others preserve dialogical settings where understanding emerges through reflection, questioning, and interpretation of inner experience. In the latter, Mary frequently appears as a stabilizing presence, one who articulates meaning when others falter. This portrayal does not elevate her above others through dominance or command. Instead, it situates her within a wisdom tradition familiar to Judaism, where insight is proven through discernment rather than power. Such authority is difficult to institutionalize. It resists easy regulation and challenges emerging structures that sought clear lines of leadership. As Christian communities expanded beyond Judea into the Greco-Roman world, pressures increased to define belief, practice, and authority more precisely. Public teaching roles became increasingly formalized. Texts that supported stable transmission of doctrine were favored, while those that complicated leadership models faced scrutiny. This process was gradual, uneven, and often unspoken, but its effects were lasting. Mary's remembered voice existed at the intersection of these developments. It carried Jewish resonance in a movement becoming increasingly Gentile. It suggested spiritual authority not grounded in office at a time when offices were solidifying. It emphasized interior transformation, when external conformity was becoming a marker of unity. Manuscript transmission reflects these pressures indirectly. Texts survive not only because they were valued, but because they were copied repeatedly. Copying required resources, approval, and space within communal life. Writings that unsettled dominant frameworks could persist for generations in limited circles and then fade as conditions changed. The fragments of the Gospel of Mary that remain today offer a glimpse into this process. They do not present a marginal figure inventing doctrine, but a respected voice engaging central questions of fear, suffering, and understanding. The disputes recorded around her words reveal that she was taken seriously enough to provoke response. Silence would have required no rebuttal. What later readers encounter as absence may once have been abundance. Lost pages, missing transitions, and abrupt endings are not neutral gaps. They mark places where transmission was interrupted, intentionally or otherwise. Each gap reminds modern readers that history is not only what survives intact, but what was allowed to continue circulating. Approaching these materials with historical care does not require accepting every claim they make. It requires acknowledging that early Christianity was shaped by conversation, conflict, and selection. Mary of Nazareth stands within that process not as an anomaly, but as a witness to how memory can be reshaped when communities decide which voices may speak for them. Her story, when placed back into its cultural and religious context, reveals a pattern familiar across history. Voices aligned with lived experience often endure longest in private memory, while public tradition preserves what best serves order and continuity. The distance between the two is where erasure begins, not through denial, but through omission. Among the texts that preserve an alternative memory of Mary, the most significant is the writing commonly known as the Gospel of Mary. It survives today only in fragments, copied centuries after the events it describes. Yet its content reflects traditions far older than the manuscripts themselves. Scholars date its composition to the early 2nd century, a period when the boundaries of Christian belief were still fluid and contested. The surviving text opens in a moment of disorientation. Jesus has departed, and his followers are overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty. This setting mirrors historical realities faced by early communities who struggled to interpret persecution, delayed expectations, and internal disagreement. In this atmosphere, Mary speaks, not as an innovator introducing new doctrine, but as one who recalls teaching meant to steady those who are losing confidence. Her speech emphasizes inner transformation, the mastery of fear, and the restoration of the soul. These themes align closely with ethical and spiritual concerns found in early Christian preaching, particularly in communities influenced by Jewish wisdom traditions. The focus is not on secret rituals or esoteric practices, but on understanding the human condition in light of divine truth. What distinguishes Mary's role in this text is not the content alone, but the reaction it provokes. Other followers challenge her authority, questioning whether such teaching could truly have been entrusted to her. The dispute does not center on whether the teaching is sound, but on whether Mary is a legitimate bearer of it. This distinction is crucial for historical interpretation. Such conflicts are not unique to this text. Early Christian literature frequently preserves disagreements over who may teach, who may interpret Revelation, and whose memory carries weight. These debates reflect real tensions as communities moved from charismatic leadership toward more defined hierarchies. Claims of private revelation became increasingly suspect as public doctrine took precedence. The Gospel of Mary preserves one such moment of transition. Mary's authority rests on experience and understanding rather than position. She speaks as one who has internalized teaching deeply enough to articulate its implications when others cannot. This kind of authority is difficult to regulate, especially in movements seeking coherence across diverse regions. The text does not portray Mary as replacing other leaders. Instead, it presents a community wrestling with fear and legitimacy. Supporters defend her not by denying the authority of others, but by appealing to her character, insight, and steadfastness. These defenses suggest that her role was remembered as credible within at least some early circles. The fragmentary nature of the text complicates interpretation. Entire sections are missing, including transitions that might clarify narrative flow and theological emphasis. Modern readers encounter abrupt breaks that leave questions unanswered, while material decay explains much of this loss. The pattern of preservation invites scrutiny. Other early Christian writings associated with Mary exhibit similar characteristics. She appears as a figure of understanding rather than proclamation, of insight rather than command. This consistent portrayal across independent traditions strengthens the case that such memories reflect genuine, early perspectives rather than later invention. Comparisons with canonical texts reveal points of convergence rather than contradiction. Mary's emphasis on trust, faithfulness, and inner renewal resonates with teachings attributed to Jesus elsewhere. The difference lies not in theology, but in narrative framing and authority attribution. Canonical texts channel teaching through selected apostolic voices. Apocryphal texts sometimes widen that circle. As orthodoxy developed, the need for clear lines of transmission became more pressing. Communities facing external pressure and internal fragmentation prioritized texts that reinforced unity and recognizable leadership structures. Writings that preserved unresolved disputes or alternative models of authority were increasingly marginalized. The Gospel of Mary was not condemned in a single decisive moment. There is no record of formal suppression or universal rejection. Instead, it appears to have gradually fallen out of circulation as copying priorities shifted. This kind of disappearance leaves little trace in historical records, yet profoundly shapes what survives. What remains today challenges modern assumptions about early Christian silence regarding women's voices. Mary's remembered speech reveals that such silence was neither original nor inevitable. It was the result of choices made over time, as communities determined which forms of memory best served their evolving identity. The historical significance of these texts does not rest on their canonical status, but on what they reveal about diversity within early Christianity. Mary of Nazareth emerges not as a marginal figure retroactively elevated, but as a voice once active in shaping understanding during a formative and unstable period. Her presence in these writings forces a reconsideration of how authority, memory, and gender intersected in the earliest generations of the movement. What was later framed as absence may, in its earliest form, have been active participation remembered long enough to trouble those who sought clearer boundaries. The words attributed to Mary in the surviving fragments do not focus on external authority, ritual status, or future reward. They address the interior struggle of the human person, describing how fear, desire, and ignorance bind the soul. This language reflects a moral and psychological framework common in early Jewish and Christian thought, where spiritual failure was understood as disordered attachment rather than mere disobedience. Such ideas were not foreign to the earliest followers of Jesus. Teachings preserved in multiple traditions emphasize watchfulness, purity of heart, and the danger of inner division. Mary's remembered speech stands firmly within this ethical landscape. It does not introduce a competing message, but articulates familiar concerns through a reflective and interpretive voice. What unsettled some hearers was not the content alone, but the implication that spiritual understanding could be articulated without institutional mediation. Mary speaks as one who has grasped meaning internally and can express it publicly. In a movement gradually defining who could speak for the community, this posed a challenge that went beyond gender and touched the nature of authority itself. Early Christian texts reveal increasing anxiety over unregulated teaching. Letters attributed to prominent leaders stress order, continuity, and the safeguarding of tradition. These concerns did not arise from abstraction, but from lived experience in communities facing fragmentation. Diverse interpretations of faith threatened cohesion, and leaders sought mechanisms to preserve unity. Within this environment, texts that foregrounded internal revelation required careful handling. Even when grounded in ethical teaching, they risked being associated with uncontrolled speculation. The Gospel of Mary navigates this tension by emphasizing responsibility, humility, and moral clarity, rather than visionary excess. Yet, The very act of recording Mary's discourse preserved a model of authority that was difficult to confine. The debate preserved around her words reflects this unease. Objections raised against her do not accuse her of false teaching, but question whether such teaching could legitimately come through her. The response offered in her defense appeals to her faithfulness and closeness to Jesus, suggesting that spiritual credibility was recognized even when formal legitimacy was disputed. This pattern mirrors broader disputes found across early Christian literature. Authority was negotiated through competing criteria: apostolic commission, moral character, interpretive insight, and communal recognition. No single standard dominated in the earliest period. Over time, however, some criteria were elevated above others to stabilize belief and practice. Mary's remembered role aligns with those criteria that would later be de-emphasized. Her authority is relational and experiential rather than institutional. She speaks from memory and understanding, not from appointment. Such authority resists codification, making it vulnerable as structures solidified. Manuscript traditions reflect these shifts indirectly. Texts that supported emerging norms were copied widely and preserved carefully. Others survived in limited geographic areas or linguistic communities. The Gospel of Mary appears to belong to this latter category, circulating long enough to be translated and recopied, yet never achieving universal acceptance. The language of the text also reveals sensitivity to internal conflict. It does not depict triumph or dominance, but addresses fear, grief, and confusion. This emotional register suggests a community still processing trauma and uncertainty. Mary's role within this setting is pastoral rather than authoritative in a legal sense. Such portrayals complicate later theological portraits that emphasize clarity and certainty. Early Christianity, as reflected in these writings, was marked by vulnerability and debate. Mary's voice speaks into that vulnerability, offering interpretation rather than command. The gradual marginalization of this voice does not require a narrative of conspiracy or deliberate erasure. It can be explained through the cumulative effects of selection, preference, and institutional need. Texts that complicated leadership models were less useful for establishing continuity across expanding communities. Yet, the survival of Mary's words, even in fragmentary form, indicates that they were not easily forgotten. They were copied, translated, and preserved with care for generations. Their eventual obscurity reflects changing priorities rather than immediate rejection. To read these fragments today is to encounter a moment when the boundaries of Christian memory were still open. Mary of Nazareth stands within that openness, speaking from within the tradition rather than against it. Her words reveal not an alternative faith, but an alternative way of holding authority, one grounded in understanding shaped by lived encounter. In this light, what later tradition presents as silence may be understood as the residue of unresolved tension. Mary's voice remained present long enough to challenge emerging norms, and absent long enough to be remembered only in fragments. Those fragments, however, continue to testify that her words once mattered enough to be preserved at all. The tension surrounding Mary's remembered authority becomes clearer when placed beside parallel disputes preserved in other early Christian writings. Arguments over who may teach, who may interpret Revelation, and whose testimony carries weight appear repeatedly in texts from the 1st and 2nd centuries. These disputes were not abstract theological exercises. They were responses to real communities attempting to survive without a single, centralized structure. In several early sources, disagreements arise not over doctrine itself, but over legitimacy. Competing voices often affirm similar ethical principles while contesting who has the right to articulate them publicly. This pattern is evident in the conflict surrounding Mary's speech. The challenge she faces is not that her words are dangerous, but that her position disrupts expectations about authority. The cultural context of the Mediterranean world reinforced these expectations. Public teaching roles were overwhelmingly associated with male authority, formal training, and recognized status, while women exercised influence within households and religious practice. Public theological instruction remained contested territory. Any tradition that blurred these boundaries risked resistance, regardless of its content. Early Christian communities inherited these social assumptions, even as they reimagined many aspects of religious life. The movement proclaimed spiritual equality and shared participation, yet it also operated within existing cultural frameworks. This created a persistent tension between theological ideals and social realities. Mary's remembered role stands at the center of this unresolved contradiction. Some early texts attempt to resolve the tension by narrowing her significance to symbolic functions. She becomes a vessel of obedience, a model of devotion, or a sign of divine favor, rather than a participant in interpretation. This shift does not negate her importance, but it reshapes it into forms less disruptive to emerging norms. Other texts resist this narrowing. They preserve scenes in which Mary speaks, explains, and comforts. These portrayals do not elevate her above others, but they refuse to silence her. The coexistence of these differing portraits indicates that early Christians did not share a single consensus about how her role should be remembered. As Christian identity became increasingly tied to public confession and formal instruction, the stakes of these debates rose. External pressures from Roman authorities and internal disagreements over belief encouraged leaders to emphasize unity and clarity. Authority needed visible anchors. Teaching required recognizable custodians. In this environment, figures whose authority rested on relational memory rather than public office became difficult to accommodate. Mary's legitimacy derived from proximity, trust, and understanding. These qualities were persuasive within intimate communities, but harder to defend as the movement expanded geographically and socially. The gradual preference for apostolic succession over experiential authority reflects this shift. Chains of transmission provided reassurance that teaching remained faithful to its origins. They offered a tangible structure that could be defended and replicated. Texts aligned with these chains were more likely to be preserved and cited. Mary's remembered words did not easily fit into such frameworks. They circulated without clear institutional sponsorship, attached to a figure whose authority could not be replicated through succession. This made them vulnerable, not because they were false, but because they were singular. Manuscript evidence suggests that communities continued to value these traditions for a time. The existence of multiple linguistic witnesses indicates that the text was translated and shared beyond its place of origin. This level of transmission implies respect and engagement rather than marginal curiosity. Over time, however, Copying decisions reflected changing priorities. Texts that supported emerging theological consensus were recopied frequently. Others were copied less often, increasing the likelihood of loss. Material fragility amplified these choices. Papyrus decayed, libraries disappeared, what was copied survived. The disappearance of Mary's fuller voice thus reflects a convergence of social expectation, institutional development, and practical transmission. No single decision erased her words. Instead, a series of small, cumulative choices reshaped the memory of her role. Yet, even in absence, traces remain. Disputes preserved in surviving texts point backward to a time when her authority was sufficiently recognized to provoke challenge. Silence, in this case, is not evidence of insignificance. It is the result of contested memory, gradually resolved in favor of stability. Mary of Nazareth emerges from this process as a figure both central and constrained. Her remembered words expose the boundaries early Christianity negotiated as it transformed from a movement of memory into a tradition of texts. What was lost in that transformation was not faith, but a range of voices that once spoke within it. The physical state of the manuscripts that preserve Mary's words offers crucial insight into how her voice reached the modern world. The primary surviving copy of the Gospel of Mary comes from a Coptic codex discovered in the late 19th century, itself copied centuries after the text was first composed. This manuscript already bears signs of interruption, with missing pages at the beginning and in the middle, breaking the narrative at precisely the moments where authority and teaching converge. These gaps are not minor. The opening loss removes the context in which Mary's discourse begins, and the central lacuna interrupts her teaching before the dispute with other followers fully unfolds. What survives feels incomplete by design, yet scholars caution against assuming deliberate excision without evidence. Ancient manuscripts were vulnerable objects. Pages tore, bindings loosened, and entire sections vanished through ordinary use and neglect. At the same time, the pattern of loss invites careful attention. The missing sections occur where Mary's authority would have been most clearly established. While coincidence remains possible, the effect is undeniable. The reader encounters her voice without the full framework that might explain why she speaks with confidence, or how her teaching was received before resistance emerged. Greek fragments discovered later confirm that the text circulated in more than one language. This indicates an earlier phase of transmission, closer to the period when debates over authority were most active. Translation requires investment. Communities do not translate texts they consider marginal or irrelevant. The decision to do so suggests that Mary's words were valued, studied, and shared across cultural boundaries. The process of copying itself involved interpretation. Scribes made choices, sometimes unconsciously, about spelling, phrasing, and even omission. While there is no proof that scribes intentionally altered this text to diminish Mary's role, the absence of strong institutional backing meant that fewer safeguards protected its integrity. Texts without authoritative sponsorship were more exposed to variation and loss. Comparison with other early Christian writings reveals a pattern. Texts aligned with emerging leadership models were preserved in multiple, well-attested copies. Texts that preserved unresolved disputes or alternative authority structures survive unevenly, often in fragments. The Gospel of Mary fits squarely within this latter category. This uneven survival shaped later perception. When canon lists began to circulate, texts known only in limited regions or fragmentary form were easier to exclude. Their partial state could be cited as evidence of unreliability, even when that condition resulted from neglect rather than origin. Absence thus became self-reinforcing. Mary's voice, mediated through such fragile transmission, entered history already diminished. What modern readers encounter is not a complete teaching, but a silhouette shaped by loss. Yet even this silhouette reveals contours that cannot be ignored. Her role is not incidental. She speaks at length. Others respond. Conflict arises. These narrative elements would be unnecessary if her presence were merely symbolic. Archaeological context reinforces this picture. Early Christian book culture was decentralized. Communities produced and circulated texts locally, often without centralized oversight. This allowed diversity to flourish, but also meant that preservation depended heavily on local conditions. When communities disappeared or assimilated, their texts often vanished with them. The rediscovery of Mary's Gospel in the modern era did not restore what was lost, but it altered the questions scholars could ask. Silence could no longer be assumed as original. Fragmentation itself became data, pointing to processes of selection and neglect rather than absence of tradition. Modern analysis treats these manuscripts not as isolated curiosities, but as witnesses to a broader landscape of early Christian memory. Mary's partial voice stands alongside other fragmentary traditions that complicate the image of a unified early church. Together, they reveal a formative period marked by plurality rather than uniformity. What survives of Mary's words does not overturn established narratives, but it destabilizes their completeness. It reminds historians that what endures is shaped as much by transmission as by origin. Her gospel was not erased in a single act. It was thinned by time, choice, and circumstance. In this sense, the manuscript fragments do more than preserve text. They preserve a question. Why did communities copy these words at all? And why did others allow them to fade? The answer lies not in theology alone, but in the intersection of authority, memory, and survival. Mary of Nazareth remains present in that intersection, her voice incomplete, yet unmistakably there. When the fragments associated with Mary are placed alongside other early Christian writings, recurring themes begin to surface with striking consistency. Across diverse texts and regions, Mary is remembered not as a peripheral witness, but as a figure associated with understanding, perseverance, and clarity in moments of collective uncertainty. This convergence suggests a shared stream of memory rather than isolated literary imagination. Several early traditions portray her as one who remains steady when others falter. Fear, doubt, and confusion often characterize the surrounding community, while Mary responds with interpretation rather than alarm. This contrast serves a narrative function, but it also reflects a remembered role within early groups struggling to interpret suffering and delay. Her presence signals continuity when expectations collapse. These portrayals align closely with Jewish wisdom traditions, where insight is demonstrated through discernment under pressure. Wisdom literature does not celebrate dominance or command, but the ability to perceive meaning beneath chaos. Mary's remembered role fits comfortably within this framework, suggesting continuity rather than rupture between Jewish spiritual practice and emerging Christian reflection. Importantly, these traditions do not present her insight as autonomous or self-generated. Her understanding is consistently portrayed as grounded in teaching already received. She recalls, interprets, and applies rather than invents. This distinction matters historically because it positions her not as a rival authority, but as a custodian of memory. Such custodianship carried significant weight in oral cultures. Memory was not passive storage, but active preservation shaped by repetition and interpretation. Those trusted with memory exercised influence over how meaning endured. Mary's repeated association with remembrance and explanation suggests that early communities recognized her capacity in this regard. The persistence of this motif across texts complicates later portrayals that emphasize silence. It becomes increasingly difficult to argue that Mary's speaking role emerged only in marginal or speculative circles. Instead, the evidence points to a remembered function that some communities preserved while others gradually set aside. The differences between texts lie not in whether Mary mattered, but in how her importance was framed. Some traditions emphasize her obedience and faithfulness. Others emphasize her understanding and speech. These emphases are not mutually exclusive, but they serve different theological and social needs. As the movement evolved, certain aspects proved easier to integrate than others. This selective integration shaped the trajectory of Christian memory. Attributes that reinforced stability and continuity were highlighted. Attributes that complicated leadership models were softened or omitted. Over time, repetition reinforced preference, and preference hardened into tradition. Mary's voice, when preserved, often appears in intimate settings rather than public proclamation. This does not diminish its significance. In early Christianity, formative teaching frequently occurred in private gatherings, meals, and conversations. The boundary between public and private instruction was fluid, especially before institutional structures solidified. As authority became increasingly associated with public teaching roles, private forms of insight lost prominence. Memory transmitted through relationship yielded to memory transmitted through office. In this transition, figures whose authority rested on personal experience rather than position were gradually reframed. Mary's remembered speech thus occupies a transitional space. It reflects an early phase when understanding circulated relationally, and it survives into a later period when such circulation was becoming less acceptable. The tension between these phases is preserved in the disputes recorded around her words. These disputes reveal more than disagreement. They expose underlying anxiety about legitimacy. Mary's defenders do not appeal to rank or succession. They appeal to her faithfulness and insight. This defense would lose persuasive power as authority criteria shifted toward institutional continuity. The gradual disappearance of this defense from dominant tradition does not negate its earlier presence. It demonstrates how standards of legitimacy evolved. What once convinced no longer sufficed. Memory adapted accordingly. Seen in this light, Mary of Nazareth stands as a bridge between two modes of religious life. One is grounded in shared memory and lived experience. The other is grounded in structure and formal transmission. Her voice belongs fully to the first and only partially to the second. The fragments that preserve her words remain valuable precisely because they capture this moment of transition. They reveal that early Christianity did not begin with fixed silence around women's speech. Silence emerged later, shaped by decisions about order, authority, and preservation. Mary's voice, though incomplete, continues to testify to a time when understanding mattered as much as office, and memory spoke before it was regulated. By the late 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christian communities faced increasing pressure to define boundaries with greater precision. External scrutiny from Roman authorities and internal disagreements over belief demanded clearer statements of identity. In response, leaders emphasized coherence, continuity, and recognizable lines of teaching that could be defended against both accusation and fragmentation. This period marked a gradual shift in how authority was understood. Earlier reliance on remembered encounters and interpretive insight gave way to emphasis on succession, office, and publicly acknowledged roles. Teaching authority became something that could be traced, cataloged, and defended through lineage rather than personal experience alone. Texts played a decisive role in this transformation. Writings that reinforced emerging norms were copied, cited, and woven into instructional use. Others, even when respected, were increasingly treated as secondary. The distinction between authoritative and non-authoritative texts hardened not through a single decree, but through repeated practice. Mary's remembered words occupied an uneasy position within this developing framework. They did not contradict central beliefs, but they preserved a model of authority that was difficult to reconcile with increasingly formalized leadership. Her speech derived credibility from understanding and proximity rather than from succession. As criteria narrowed, such credibility became harder to justify publicly. Patristic literature reflects this narrowing indirectly. Early theologians rarely attack Mary's role outright. Instead, they focus attention elsewhere, emphasizing apostolic figures whose authority could be more easily integrated into developing structures. Silence replaced debate. Absence replaced argument. This shift did not require condemnation. Texts could simply fall out of use. Communities instructed new generations with materials that supported clarity and uniformity. Writings that preserved unresolved tensions were less useful in catechesis and public instruction. Over time, they were copied less frequently, stored less carefully, and eventually forgotten. Mary's voice thus faded, not because it lacked value, but because it no longer served the same function. As Christianity transitioned from a movement of memory to a tradition of institutions, different forms of authority were prioritized. What could not be standardized was quietly sidelined. The process resembles developments in other ancient traditions where diversity narrowed as movements matured. Early plurality gave way to defined orthodoxy. This was not unique to Christianity, nor was it inherently malicious. It was a response to scale, survival, and the demands of continuity. Yet the cost of this process was real. Certain ways of remembering were diminished. Certain voices, once active, became symbolic. Mary of Nazareth was preserved as an object of devotion, reverence, and theological reflection, but her remembered speech receded from view. This transformation reshaped how later generations encountered her. She became a figure spoken about, rather than a figure who spoke. Her interior life was honored, but her interpretive role was muted. What survived was a carefully framed image compatible with established structures. Modern scholarship does not seek to reverse this process, but to understand it. By tracing how texts circulated, disappeared, or endured, historians can reconstruct the forces that shaped collective memory. Mary's fragmented gospel becomes evidence not of error, but of selection. The recovery of suppressed or neglected texts in recent centuries has reopened these questions. Manuscripts long buried in deserts or libraries have reintroduced complexity into narratives once thought settled. They reveal that early Christian memory was broader, more contested, and more dynamic than later tradition suggests. Mary's voice, though incomplete, participates in this recovered complexity. It challenges the assumption that silence was original. It demonstrates that what later became marginal was once present enough to require response. In the end, the erasure of Mary's words was not an act of denial, but a consequence of resolution. As Christianity defined itself, it chose stability over plurality, clarity over tension. Mary remained central, but in a reshaped form. What was lost was not her faith, her significance, or her devotion. What faded were the words that once expressed her understanding. Those words survive now only in fragments, not to undermine tradition, but to remind history that the earliest voices were more numerous than those that ultimately prevailed. The modern rediscovery of early Christian manuscripts transformed the study of Christian origins by reintroducing voices long absent from the conversation. Texts, once known only by name or rumor, emerged from desert sands and forgotten collections, preserved by chance rather than intention. Their survival forced scholars to confront the limits of inherited narratives and to distinguish between original silence and later absence. The fragments associated with Mary of Nazareth belong to this broader pattern of recovery. Their discovery did not create new traditions, but illuminated older ones that had persisted beyond official memory. By placing these fragments alongside canonical writings, historians gained new tools to assess how early Christian diversity was gradually shaped into coherence. Scholarly analysis approaches these texts with caution. They are not treated as replacements for canonical scripture, nor as secret revelations hidden from the faithful. Instead, they are examined as historical witnesses to the range of belief, practice, and memory present in the first centuries. Their value lies in what they reveal about early communities rather than in claims of exclusive authority. Philological study of the surviving fragments reveals careful composition rather than improvisation. The language is measured, ethical, and restrained. It lacks the hallmarks of later speculative systems and remains closely tied to concerns evident in early preaching. This strengthens the argument that the traditions it preserves reflect early currents rather than late invention. Comparative analysis further situates Mary's words within established streams of thought. Parallels appear in early sermons, ethical exhortations, and wisdom sayings preserved across Christian literature. These similarities suggest that the text did not emerge in isolation, but participated in ongoing reflection about fear, faith, and understanding. Archaeology contributes additional context. The material conditions of early book production reveal how easily texts could be lost without deliberate suppression. Manuscripts were expensive, vulnerable, and dependent on continuous copying. When a text ceased to serve communal needs, its survival was endangered regardless of its content. This perspective tempers dramatic narratives of conspiracy while still acknowledging real processes of exclusion. Selection does not require intent to erase. Preference alone can shape memory decisively. Over generations, what is preferred becomes normal, and what is not preferred becomes invisible. Mary's fragmented voice illustrates this dynamic with unusual clarity. Her presence in early texts indicates recognition. Her absence in later tradition reflects changing priorities rather than historical insignificance. Understanding this distinction allows for a more nuanced view of early Christian development. Modern readers often approach these materials with contemporary concerns in mind, seeking validation or correction. Historical study resists such impulses. It aims not to resolve modern debates, but to reconstruct past realities as faithfully as possible. In doing so, it reveals a movement negotiating identity under pressure. Within that movement, Mary of Nazareth functioned as a bridge between memory and meaning. Her remembered words addressed fear at a moment when certainty was fragile. That role was essential early on, even if it later became less visible. The renewed study of her gospel does not destabilize Christian faith. Instead, it enriches understanding of how that faith took shape. It reminds readers that doctrine emerged through conversation, conflict, and choice, rather than instantaneous consensus. By acknowledging the presence of voices that were later sidelined, history becomes more honest and more complex. Mary's voice joins a chorus of early witnesses whose contributions were not uniform, yet collectively formative. What remains today is an invitation to listen carefully to fragments without forcing them to say more than they do. They speak of early communities wrestling with fear, authority, and understanding. They speak of a woman whose insight was once compelling enough to be remembered and transmitted. In recognizing this, modern scholarship restores context rather than authority. Mary of Nazareth is not reclaimed as a rival voice, but as a historical one. Her words, though incomplete, expand the horizon of early Christian memory and remind history that what survives is never the whole story. Part X. Mary of Nazareth stands at the threshold between what early Christians experienced and what later generations chose to preserve. Her remembered words, surviving only in fragments, do not demand revision of doctrine or reversal of tradition. They demand something quieter and more difficult. Recognition that early Christian memory was shaped by human choice as much as divine conviction. The historical record shows that her voice once functioned within living communities. It comforted, interpreted, and steadied those facing fear and uncertainty. These are not marginal concerns, but foundational ones, present wherever belief confronts loss, delay, or doubt. That her words address such moments explains why they were preserved at all. Over time, the needs of the movement changed. Stability required structure. Continuity required clear custodianship of teaching. In this transition, certain forms of authority proved easier to sustain than others. Voices grounded in relational memory gradually gave way to voices grounded in office and succession. Mary's transformation within tradition reflects this shift. She remained central, but in a redefined way. Devotion replaced discourse. Symbol replaced speech. Her silence became a feature of reverence rather than a question of history. Modern recovery of her fragmented gospel does not reverse that transformation. It clarifies it. By tracing how her words circulated, conflicted, and faded, historians gain insight into how early Christianity moved from plurality toward coherence. The process was neither purely organic nor purely imposed. It was negotiated through countless decisions made in specific communities over generations. Mary's voice did not disappear because it lacked meaning. It disappeared because meaning alone no longer determined preservation. Usefulness, clarity, and institutional fit increasingly guided transmission. What endured did so because it could be stabilized, taught uniformly, and defended publicly. Yet fragments endure precisely because memory is resilient. Even when marginalized, it leaves traces. These traces challenge simple narratives of origin and remind historians that early faith was lived before it was codified. Mary's words belong to that lived phase, where understanding was shared in conversation rather than decree. To acknowledge this is not to undermine tradition, but to deepen it. Tradition becomes more credible when it admits its own development. Faith becomes more grounded when it recognizes the humanity of its transmission. Mary of Nazareth emerges from historical study not diminished, but clarified. She is neither a silent ideal nor a suppressed revolutionary. She is a witness whose remembered understanding once mattered enough to be spoken, debated, copied, and preserved, even imperfectly. What was erased was not her presence, but the space her words occupied. That space reveals an early moment when insight, memory, and proximity shaped authority before structure finalized it. In recovering awareness of that moment, history does not rewrite belief. It restores complexity. Mary's fragmented voice remains unfinished, and it will remain so. Yet, in its incompleteness, it continues to speak, not with commands, but with evidence. Evidence that early Christian memory was broader than later tradition allowed. Evidence that silence is often the result of selection, not absence. In the end, Mary of Nazareth does not stand outside the story of Christian origins. She stands within it, reminding history that what survives is never the whole, and that even erased words can still illuminate how faith first learned to speak.